Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so judging by the responses and how popular that video seems to be, the answer seems to be yes. People are very much interested in me continuing the remaster of the Avengers and New Avengers videos that I did back in the day. Here's a cool thing. We're actually going to include stuff in these videos that we didn't do the first time around because they didn't really seem to be important, only for me to turn around and realize they were important. Perfect example. This story. So this is cool, right? Because if you guys remember, when it comes to Jonathan Hickman, he's all about like, he'll tell some great big huge, you know, like 6-issue story or a one-shot story or something like that. And that story will basically just be a series of things that happen. But one thing in that story will be incredibly important and play a role later on down the line. But what this does here is it picks up with a character named Zhang, who's not exceedingly important, right? I mean, I guess a little bit important, but not exceedingly important. Instead, the big thing that's taking place here is you basically have essentially these soldiers more or less trying to break into this facility that Zhang and presumably Iron Man occupy for whatever reason, right? They seem to be up to something that they're not supposed to be allowed to do. But the big thing that comes out of this is where the door initially gets smashed down and work is being done exceedingly fast, right? Where things are being done as fast as they can in order to initiate this mission, we're suddenly met by the arrival of the future Franklin Richards. Now, here's the important thing to understand here. Franklin Richards from the future will appear again in this story, and he's probably one of the single most important characters, or not really the most important characters, but at least in terms of the information he offers, is probably one of the most important characters that we'll see later on in Marvel. But for the collapse of the multiverse, there's not a whole lot that Franklin Richards can do. And in fact, even if there was anything he could do, he's not going to, and we'll actually find out why later. But the cool thing here is he basically talks about how this machine generates tachyons, right? About 1,000 times above normal, and that it maintains a class 5 containment field, right? So basically, Franklin Richards has just kind of shown up here in the midst of everything that's sort of going on and asking the question, are you guys planning a trip? And the response of Iron Man in what's probably one of the coolest Iron Man suits ever basically says like, hey, you know, don't try to stop me in what it is that I'm doing. And the response of Franklin is, we've known each other for a long time, and then refers to this person as Rhodey, and then says like, why would I try to stop you in the first place? And so basically what's happened here is that this person, who we can kind of assume is James Rhodes, we'll find out who it actually is later on, but we can assume it's James Rhodes, and has in effect created a time machine. That's basically what this is. That's the question that's asked by Franklin. Like, do you know what it is that you've done? Like, do you realize what it is that you've created here? And the response is yes, we know exactly what we've done, right? And so the question is asked, do you know what the rules of this are? And the response of James is, there are no rules. And that's 100% true. The funny thing about this is a little bit of a modification by time travel from Jonathan Hickman. Historically speaking, in Marvel Comics, when it comes to time travel, it works in the sense of branch universe theory, right? So let's say, for example, that Captain America got his hands on a time machine and decided to go back into the past and stop the moment when let's say Bruce Banner became the Incredible Hulk. Bruce Banner's exposed to the gamma bomb, he's exposed to the rays, he becomes the Incredible Hulk. Let's say that like Captain America showed up and then grabbed him and just ran out of the bomb blast radius, right? Assuming that he could. Then what that would mean is you would have an alternate universe. That universe they're currently living in, where Bruce Banner never became the Hulk, that now becomes an alternate reality. So that's the way that time travel always worked in Marvel. It just created a whole bunch of branch universes. What Hickman did here was basically modify that and say that seemingly there's a continuing timeline. Now, there's not a whole lot of reconciliation here, but it is cool because it's basically this idea that they're going to go back in time and modify things a bit, but for the most part, everything is going to kind of stay the same. The next thing we do is we jump to the modern day. And what this does is it basically picks up with the Avengers more or less having a barbecue. And rightfully so, right? They just finished the whole Infinity event, the builders and all that kind of stuff, that great big huge conflict. They're basically resting their souls from war. It's kind of funny because there's this conversation, you know, where people are asking like, what all do we have? You know, and the response of Thor is like, well, we prepared steaks and hamburgers and veggie burgers. I just want to point out that it's strange that Thor is making veggie burgers. I feel like if there's anybody on the Avengers team that would be avidly against vegetable-based burgers, it would be Thor. Thor would be like, veggie burgers, a meal for children and weaklings. I feel like that'd be the response of Thor. Thor would be like, give me meat, not fake meat, not the Impossible Whopper. That's how I'm sorry, I don't need to offend anybody. I'm just saying, right? Like if Thor rolled up at Burger King and ordered an Impossible Whopper, not knowing what he was getting, he would take a bite of it, throw it on the ground and say, what devilry is this, right? Like, I feel like that's what would happen. But it's kind of cool because you end up having like this kind of conversation where Captain Universe shows up, right? Now, Captain Universe, again, we've talked about her before, but because of the fact that we haven't done this in a little while, I'll do a little bit of a rehash here. Captain Universe is basically the name given to a person who possesses what's called the Enigma Force. And the Enigma Force hails from the microverse, right? This itty bitty microscopic universe inside the main Marvel universe. And the Enigma Force only ever really manifests itself in times of dire need, and it bonds itself to an individual, right? Now, once that person's bond with the Enigma Force, then they're christened as Captain Universe. In this instance, it was bonded to a woman who was basically involved in a car wreck, and the full-on origin of her can be found down in the playlist down in the description, so you can kind of be kept aware of what's going on. But she was basically kind of bonded with the Captain Universe, and this is really just kind of Jonathan Hickman having her here for the purpose of showing how drastic things are, right? Because it's one of these scenarios where Captain Universe is not all-encompassing. It's not this being that can basically destroy anything it wants to in the entirety of the universe. There are beings out there that are vastly more powerful than Captain Universe, right? Matthew Malloy's a good example, the Marquis of Death easily, Chaos King probably. Well, I'd say definitely Chaos King because it was hopping around the multiverse. The Star Brand, depending on what kind of threat they're facing off against, but it's not some indestructible thing. It's more of a symbolic being, right? They're like, things are that bad because the universe basically has its own defense system in the form of Captain Universe, and they still can't save anything. And now again, at this point, they're not fully aware of that. We are more or less as the audience because of the fact that, this story's 6 years old, but it's kind of a cool thing because when the question's asked by Captain Universe, do you have any pie? The response of Thor is yes, right? We have made ready such pastries and have done so with vigor. And then he says, bring forth the pies. And here comes the Incredible Hulk just bearing trays of pies, right? Like beer pie, which I don't even know what, I don't even want to know what that tastes like. Mead pie. Actually, I kind of want to know what beer pie tastes like now that I think about it. But basically the Avengers are just kind of relaxing, right? And they're enjoying themselves. Now, at this point, we jump to Iron Man and we jump to Captain America, and they're basically talking about the Avengers machine, right? The Avengers program. Now, here's the important thing to understand, and I don't know if we've fully covered this early on in the story. The important thing about this conversation between these two is that at some point in the past, Captain America and Iron Man basically came up with the idea of Avengers World, in the sense that with the world being the way that it is, you have all various kinds of threats that are out there. And a lot of this seems to be based off of the events of Civil War, right? The 50 State Initiative, all that kind of stuff. Those are you guys who remember my Civil War videos. But the idea here is they basically said, okay, we have an Avengers in the United States, and that's fine. We can face off against various threats. But what we need are different Avengers teams for various threats, because not all Avengers are needed for a particular conflict, right? So if we end up having a scenario like the Builders or something like that, we want to make sure we bring our heavy hitters, right? We bring Thor, we bring the Incredible Hulk, that we bring Tony Stark, who's a futurist, somebody along those lines. We want the Star Brand, right? Because the Builders are a super significant threat. The same thing with Thanos, right? The same thing with somebody like the Marquis of Death showing up or something along those lines. But if we have a conflict where it's just something that's relatively small beans, advanced idea mechanics, right? The scientific arm of Hydra. If they do something that's not a planetary threat, they kind of seem to go awry or whatever it is, and they just kind of have to be curtailed and reminded of their place in the bigger picture, we can send Black Widow and Hawkeye and Shang-Chi and maybe a couple other people, maybe Iron Fist or somebody like that. We can send them small beans because we don't need a great big huge contingent, right? It's different Avengers teams that serve different purposes, and the various Avengers teams would be placed at different locations throughout the world, hence the name Avengers World. And that's why they're having this conversation where you have Captain America talking about Wolverine and saying, we're gonna move Wolverine off the board, right? He has too much going on, and he does. At the time this story was written, the X-Men had just come out of schism, right? So you had Wolverine, who broke off the X-Men team and went to go form the Jean Grey School of Higher Learning. You had Cyclops, who stayed after having killed Charles Xavier and had the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. So you basically had two different X-Men schools. You got Wolverine's time on the Avengers, plus you have Wolverine's own ongoing story taking place, right? So it was just kind of removing him, and it's a great way for Jonathan Hickman to kind of look at the character of Wolverine with everything he's doing in Marvel Comics and basically say, we're taking him off the Avengers for the moment because he's just got too much going on. And it's kind of a funny thing because Tony Stark looks at Captain America and says, you're thinking about this in too rigid of a capacity. It's not a chess game, right? It's not my move, your move, my move, your move. It's not necessarily like that, right? This is one of these things where it's a living organism. The teams fluctuate, they change. Just because we have an Avengers team on one side of the world and an Avengers team here in the States does not mean that roster never changes. It doesn't mean that we don't switch people off those teams and put them into different locations. That's kind of the important thing that's going on here, right? It's these two guys creating a worldwide Avengers team with constantly moving parts. They can shift around as they need to based on the particular conflict. Now, that's one of the most important things to come out of the story, because we're going to find out later on, this becomes a lot bigger than a planetary Avengers team. But the other part of this is that they're suddenly met by the arrival of this version of Iron Man from the future. And what, of course, this version of Iron Man does is really kind of hit up two things. The first is that they're a little bit off target insofar as the time travel they've engaged in time, that they're not as far back as they're supposed to be. And the other thing is that they know that because there's a Hyperion here, right? It's important to say, to look at how this is phrased, there shouldn't be a Hyperion here. In Marvel Comics, those of you guys who are not familiar with this, in Marvel Comics, Hyperion is the closest allegory Marvel has to Superman in DC Comics, right? In this run by Hickman, you actually get this amazing sort of one-shot with Hyperion, where he basically kind of outlines all the powers Hyperion has and what he can do. And he is almost a shot-for-shot remake of Superman. The only person that's closer than that is the Sun God, when we're basically looking at like the bridge and the alternate realities and so on. But this version of Iron Man kind of looks around and is met, of course, by Tony Stark. And Tony Stark's like, what in the world is going on here? And why do you look like you have my armor? And basically this version of Iron Man shuts down the suit of Tony Stark, right? Like shuts the whole thing down. And then it's just kind of like, okay, like what in the heck is happening, right? Tony Stark's like, what in the world is going on? And this version of Iron Man basically says there's still time, and basically explains that a rogue planet is headed towards Earth. Now, this seems insignificant insofar as saying there's a rogue planet on its way. It seems unimportant. The thing to keep in mind is this will become incredibly important here in a little while, right? Probably in the next few videos that we're going to do, it's going to become incredibly important, a major plot point, right? Now, the other important thing that I feel like Hickman kind of missed here is the role of SWORD, right? The Sentient World Observation and Response Department. SWORD is basically S.H.I.E.L.D., except they monitor space instead of monitoring Earth, for those of you guys who are familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And the whole point of SWORD is, or at least if SWORD had done its job like it was supposed to, it'd be aware of this rogue planet, right? They'd be like, hey guys, there's a planet heading towards Earth. We should probably do something about it. But it seems at this point, SWORD has not become aware of it, because Iron Man basically says you guys have about a month before this planet gets here. Now, this planet's huge in size. It's about the size of Earth, maybe a little bit bigger. And so it's one of these things where it's kind of like, you guys could destroy it, but let's see if we can't do something better. But the funny thing about this is that Bruce Banner kind of chimes in and says, here's the thing you have to understand though, right? Like a rogue planet doesn't just appear out of nowhere. A rogue planet is basically a planet that was knocked out of its orbit by some manner in some means, right? Like you've got a solar system out there somewhere in some part of the galaxy, or even in a wholly different galaxy outside of ours. And maybe like an asteroid or some object of sufficient strength hits it and knocks it out of its orbit, right? Then what'll happen is, because planets are rotating around their stars at, like half a million miles per hour, then if it gets hit, then it has the impact of whatever hit it, which actually speeds up how fast it's moving, and then it gets pushed, out in some direction. And so basically this thing was knocked out of its orbit and it's been traveling towards Earth at 500,000 miles per hour. But the important thing to understand here is that it's doing it in a straight line. And that's what Bruce Banner and Tony Stark pick up on, right? The idea is that if it's moving in a straight line, that means somebody sent it towards Earth. Now, it takes time for objects to travel from like one side of the galaxy to another. And even if something's traveling at 500,000 miles per second, it's going to take light years for it to get here. And Bruce Banner hits up on this idea that, if this thing was shot in a straight line, then it means that thousands or millions of years ago, somebody basically sent this thing towards our direction. And so the amount of planning that it would take for a person to know that they would have to knock a planet out of orbit, send it towards the Earth, and that it would actually collide with Earth at some point in time, the calculations would be insane. It's almost impossible. You have to see the future. It's nuts. And then Iron Man kind of asked the question, well, what makes you think that it's being sent here from a few million years ago? What makes you think that somebody didn't just, it was a rogue planet that was kind of making its way, somebody didn't just show up recently and send it on a path towards us, right? This is the importance of Tony Stark, three-dimensional thinking, right? Thinking on multiple levels and with multiple variables, right? That's what made Tony Stark such an impactful character in Marvel Comics. If you're going to be a futurist, you're going to be an engineer, you're going to be the kind of person that Tony Stark is, you have to think on multiple levels and in multiple dimensions in order to be able to pull off any one particular task, right? This is how his mind works. And so with the help of this future Iron Man, the Avengers end up constructing this device that they basically plan to embed inside this rogue planet. And they successfully do, right? The funny thing is that Tony Stark kind of asks this person, like, what are you creating, right? This Iron Man is creating something for Tony Stark and won't tell them what it is. And it's kind of like, you're going to have to open it at a future date, but it's basically a present for you, right? It's something that I'm leaving behind for you. And so with this particular device that's basically created, once this device is teleported with the help of Eden, who has the ability to teleport things across various spaces, including a full universal space, you end up having him basically teleport this device into space. The Incredible Hulk jumps up and then pushes it, right? Like literally with the force of his jump, pushes it directly into the path of the rogue planet. Now, when it lands on that rogue planet, instead of destroying it, once it's embedded inside and the object is activated, once it's powered on, what it does is it actually changes the phase of the object. That in a sense, it's basically just slightly out of phase with the main universe, right? So, and it's almost intangible is really more or less what it means. And what happens is it allows this world to sort of pass through or to enter into to Earth's orbit, right? So they're basically the Earth and this rogue planet occupying the same space at the same time. And then once everything is all done, once the device is set to where it's supposed to be, then basically it allows the two worlds to more or less occupy the same space at the same time and more or less marry. Now, the reason why that matters is explained with this future version of Iron Man, that when they take their helmet off, this person reveals themselves to be the granddaughter of Tony Stark. It looks like, because of the fact that they're referred to as Rhodey, it looks like it's the actual daughter of James Rhodes, or the granddaughter of James Rhodes, that it's not actually the biological child of Tony Stark. But we can kind of assume that it is, right? Probably because James Rhodes died and Tony Stark took her to raise, and basically, raised her as his own daughter, and she came to see him as a father. That's more or less what happened here. But basically, she kind of explains that having these two worlds occupy the same space at the same time will provide an infinite amount of energy for Earth to basically do almost anything they want to. And the reason why this was done was because this will be important later on, that where these circumstances originally played out with the Avengers and so on becoming aware of the rogue planet and then ultimately destroying it, then instead this will provide an energy source that's much needed. Now again, we're going to find out why that matters once we get to the whole segment about the return of Franklin Richards. But basically, this future version of Tony says, it's important that you take time to celebrate what's happening here right now, that you enjoy your life at the moment, because everything is about to get exceedingly dark. All the Avengers are about to know what you've been secretly doing alongside the Illuminati. Everything, all this time is about to run out. Everything that you know is about to completely and totally come to an end. And it is. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. I know it seems a little cloak and dagger with a lot of lack of explanation, and we'll see it in a future video. But that's the way Hickman works, guys. That's the way that Hickman does things. Everything builds on top of everything else. But we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. Now we'll catch you all later. Peace.
About the trees and the seas, how it's all connected. The flowers and the birds.